the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 98.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you. And today we have on David Williams again from dissigno. And we discuss some of the implications of the old grid in these disasters that we've seen, and what are some of the solutions that we might see in the future with newer technology and how that could impact the grid. Always enjoy the discussion with David, and so without further ado, here's my conversation with David Williams. Well, David, a lot's happened in the world since the last time we spoke. It's good to have you back on the program. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get into it. We've covered the hurricane a little bit, and recently there's there's been an earthquake in Mexico, and a lot's going on. And the past few times you've come on, we've talked about this idea of decentralizing the grid. And so let's just kind of step back before we go too far into that. What are your thoughts on what's happened in Mexico, what's happened in Florida as far as the hurricane, and in Texas, obviously, the hurricanes and the earthquakes? Mm-hmm. What is your thought on how the grid has been able to respond as it sits today?
Well, I think each one of those examples has a unique perspective. In general, the grids themselves are proving to be not as resilient as we would like them to be. But part of that's just because of the inherent nature. There's a decrease in resiliency when you have a single large generator or single distribution networks that extend out from there. And so that kind of hub and spoke infrastructure leaves a lot of these grids vulnerable.
Okay, one thing you said there about the grid being vulnerable, I was working with a guy one time who was in, I think it was Guam, and he talked about, this has been years ago, he said, he worked and there was a hurricane or something, bad storm hit Guam, and because the way they had their power set up with all their power lines were underground and stuff, that they were able to get back online within a few days. Now, the destruction and stuff was still there and took a while to clean up. Do you think that this is the time maybe for us, at least in America, to sit back and go, you know what? We've got a lot of power lines that are above ground. Maybe we should, as we go to retool or rebuild certain parts of infrastructure, putting it underground.
Absolutely. And I think that dialogue is going on in a lot of different ways because the grid itself is an old system and built on kind of different ways of delivering power to individuals. And that connection to the individual is the most important piece, but really the most challenging because it's at the little last connection into someone's home. So I think not just do we put the power lines underground, but do we look at localized storage solutions that make sense in specifically at nodes around very dense populated places? Do we look at software that we've talked about before on the show that allows individuals to put their resources onto the grid and through that the marketplaces that allows them to make money doing it? And so the grid itself is going through a big evolution. I think what we see specifically in places like some of the devastation in Puerto Rico, that to do that work is very expensive. And to take that existing mindset and do things like Guam, as you suggested, has been able to do, requires a lot of capital. And so in places that don't have access to capital or credit markets like Puerto Rico, for instance, it does really kind of make the problem that much worse. Okay, so now
we've kind of said that we kind of looked at a few of the issues, but let's step back and say, in a perfect world, a decentralized world, if you will, what could have been different if the grid was more decentralized? Some of these ideas we talked about in the past, we're here, they're vibrant, and they're in areas like we'll leave Puerto Rico out of it because obviously their economy is a little bit behind the U.S. But just in Florida or Texas, what could a decentralized grid have done to change maybe some of the outages we saw or to get people back online quicker?
Yeah, and I think there's a few veins in that question, and some of them are kind of focused on different kinds of energy delivery. I think that in a decentralized grid, if we look at that as the individuals will be the resources to the grid, and there's a market mechanism that allows them to participate, that we'll see both there's a resiliency and a transparency in the grid, and that allows individuals to be part of the mechanism that gets the system back online. So, for instance, if we do lose, and I think a lot of this is not well understood, that not every power plant is able to start without another power plant. And so there are power plants that are incapable of coming online by themselves, and they require a lot of power from the grid to turn on the next one. And so it's not as simple as just being able to put different generators around in very specific locations. What I think we'll see, and in the kind of, it depends on how far in the future you look, that if we look all the way to the horizon, that the decentralized grid will require very sophisticated software on probably blockchain style logic that allows for this peer-to-peer relationship. I think we'll also see that there'll be an increasing demand or adoption of electric vehicles, especially in very dense populations, and that in islanded style communities, whether that's parts of Florida that may be inaccessible due to the storms or parts of the Gulf Coast, that if there's a significant amount of EVs and there's a good market mechanism, it does allow you to essentially swarm those storage resources to the places that are needed the most. And so I think we'll find this technology will allow kind of resilience at the most local level, because a lot of these challenges are happening underneath power lines that may be working. And so it's just a resource requirement or constraint to get people out to fix those things. And it takes a long time to get there.
Okay, so let me just play a little bit of devil's advocate here. You said that some power plants, as we know, you have to have one to start another one. So if you get a strategic power plant down, well, then that could affect a larger area. But couldn't someone say, well, if the power went out and it was more decentralized, in an area that was decentralized rather, and so now everyone who had was monitoring their power and running off of smart technology, now they're all out, and there is you still have that one source, but it would cause more chaos because there's not one spot to go to.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that brings up a good point that, the downside of a distributed network is a lack of concentration. And that means that you have to be able to, solve this problem in multiple places. I think what I'm hopeful for is, and it's particularly around natural disasters, whether it's earthquakes or hurricanes or this kind of increasing intensity in storms, that damage does tend to be somewhat localized. And so and unpredictable. So the ability to look into the future and know where landfall for hurricanes will be is not an exact science. So I think what we will find is that portions of the grid will be destroyed, and that some portions of on-site generation, whether that's diesel generators or solar or maybe wind and energy storage, will be able to come online. And they will be able to do so without the grid infrastructure coming together. And today, in a lot of these places, we do see that there are local diesel generators that are able to start up, and then maybe the renewables are able to follow on to that. So, I mean, I hear you. I think that as we start to see more and more distributed energy, the benefit is that it's distributed, but the challenge is that if you had to fix lots of it, and in the instances like we're in these island communities that have mass disruption, then if you really are able to do more than half of the infrastructure, then you've now created a much bigger problem to solve.
Okay, so let me ask you this. One of the things you see, whether you like this or not, it's just kind of a reality. When stuff happens, big landmark type stuff, policy can be changed because people are very reactionary and they're willing to hear different ideas or maybe flip-flop on a position that they previously held. When we look at these storms, and if you're saying, okay, you know what, we're really trying to push for this type of distributed energy, how would we go about doing that? How do we use, and we don't want to pile up on someone who's having a hard time, obviously, because of the hurricane, or earthquake, or whatever the case may be. But how do we use this to say, you know what, this is kind of an example of, well, this is what happened, and here's what we know happened because of, we had these policies, we've done it this way. But you know what, theoretically, we could have done it like this. So how do you go about doing that in a way that lawmakers might hear? Do you go to like a Florida or a Texas, or do you go outside the U.S. and say, Mexico maybe more open to hear this, or Puerto Rico?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that on all fronts. And so we're already seeing it in the heavily regulated markets like California, the ideas of resource adequacy or this resilience of the grid and the ability to have 15 or 20% more resources available than we actually think we're going to need in most circumstances. It has slowly become more regional. And I think someday we'll see that resource adequacy at the very local level. So that's one big, very slow moving idea of how do you kind of look at the regulatory environment and help the individual become more resilient. I think on the other side, from the ground up, we're seeing that individuals are more open to on-site renewables or just distributed generation more broadly for the value of the resilience that it provides them. And I think that's really important place to kind of touch is that in the past, we've really priced renewables or how much does a diesel genset cost and how much is the diesel and look at that at price per kilowatt hour. But what we're talking about now is something much more profound. What does it mean for you to be able to have energy for the next 1, 2, 10 days in a time when you need it? And we've started to see some of those, like Puerto Rico has been a really good example as the communication networks were broken, that the mayors or leaders of these small communities that were isolated don't have any way to charge their phones or to communicate, or the towers, the cell towers themselves. And so the response is hampered by that. And I think if we take that same kind of idea and apply it to energy, maybe it's not just doing solar on everyone's houses, but it's making sure that you have more on-site diesel storage. Or as we look to a lot of these islanded communities, and they're a good example because things are happening so rapidly, if the island's completely dependent on the arrival of a diesel ship on a every other day basis, what does it mean for your business to be able to go 1 or 2 missed shipments? And unfortunately, we are seeing more of these kind of activity that is disrupting kind of traditional shipping mechanisms or just the logistics around kind of pipeline delivery and some of the ways in which we have done it in the past. How do we do that in a better way?
Yeah, and one of the things I found interesting was the federal government, changed the policy on making withdrawals from your IRA and your 401k during this time. If you needed money, that you instead of paying the penalty, there was, I don't want to get it, contact your advisor for what all happened there. But I was reading about some of the stuff that was going on there, and I just thought, it's interesting. We're able to change these laws, to allow these people to access their money now. And what we're talking about when we look at some of this stuff is really the government prevention of some of these ideas that kind of keep us from going back. And you touched on something there a minute ago. You said something to the effect of, well, what is it worth for you? If we had a more decentralized grid, and people were able to kind of make their own decisions about what they want to do, what you would see, I think, is like you would see in most market economies, you would see, well, Bob over here, he's kind of always prepared for the worst, and he's got everything kind of stored up, and then you got Tom over here who's a little bit he's gonna let it ride and hope that the worst doesn't happen. And then when disaster strikes, you would have a potential for more people who are able to come and meet those needs. Now, one of the things we see in disasters is you kind of have this debate over price gouging. Should these gas stations or whatever be able to price gouge? And part of the problem is that if you have a limited amount of people that can access the market, in this case you're talking about getting diesel to these countries, then it allows for opportunities for people to price gouge because person A goes, you know what, I'm the main person who can get here, I can price gouge. But if there's 50 people, well, 10 may price gouge, but the rest of them don't, and then they get long-term deals when everything comes back normal. So I think maybe a little bit of government deregulation. We see it happening, at least from the financial side, and so hopefully we can transition that to the energy side.
Absolutely, and I think these crises do bring up very specific things, and one of the ones that has been in the news in the last few days is the Jones Act, and I'm not an expert at all, but the shipping logistics challenges of getting things to and from Puerto Rico has been long kind of protected by the shipping industry's Jones Act. And I don't have enough expertise to know if it makes sense or not, but because there's a specific challenge of getting resources to Puerto Rico, it has allowed these very specific issues to come to light of like, does it make sense to continue to support these laws that were applicable in a different time? And then, things have changed dramatically. We do see the governments move very quickly when it makes sense. And so I do think that it is probably a mechanism for less regulation and not more. But as you also described, that sometimes is a bigger benefit for those with resources than those without. And so there is an underlying kind of component to all of this that those with the means to have on-site renewables or diesel storage or are able to better survive these storms will be at such a significant advantage to those that do not, that we're going to have to come up with better mechanisms to how to have the right level of response for those people.
Right. I think the question is, when you look at that, if you look at it, and this is kind of a philosophical question almost, but you say, well, if there's two people who have equal amount of access to resources and one person decides to prepare for the worst and one person doesn't, the question is how do how do you not leave that person who didn't prepare out in the cold, just to kind of use a term there. But on the other hand, it is kind of a tough spot because you go, well, you did have the chance to prepare and you didn't. And a lot of times we're not talking about those people, though. We're talking about the people who didn't have the chance to prepare and then now they're stuck. And those are the people that we definitely want to protect because they didn't have the money, the access, or the ability. But as far as accessing, you talk about the government moving quickly. We were talking offline about Mexico and some of the stuff that's going on down there. What we see right now is the Mexican economy is begging for U.S. crude oil and natural gas to be shipped down there because their infrastructure, they've redone their policy. But it just takes a long time to build the roads so they can go drill. So there's still 5 to 10 years before they can actually develop their resources. And so they really want, Texas, because it's right here, Texas oil and gas. And it's kind of frustrating because you sit back and you go, okay, here is a one-to-one where you have a supplier in the U.S. who could sell to Mexico, but they have to go through all of these processes to get that done. And then you see a disaster strike with Mexico, and you go, okay, well we've changed regulations now because of this, and we're allowing it for this window. And so for me, it just kind of gets a frustrating deal because it's like, you know what, I'm not saying that this would have made a big dent in the Mexican earthquake, but if we can change the regulation because there's a natural disaster, the regulation probably doesn't have a whole lot of merit to begin with.
Fair enough. Yeah. And I think we've seen that in a lot of these markets, that the mechanisms that define the regulations and the rulemaking that sits on top of that are long and cumbersome, and that the politics play a large role into that. And maybe so much so that it's got very little to do with the specific instances or the specific law. It's something much different that's at play that keeps those regulations in place. I think you're kind of touching on something here too, that is this underlying theme that energy is a global commodity and has not always been treated like that, but we're starting to see these very large symptoms of that where energy prices are high, are somewhat transient, and they're probably a combination of factors that led to that, but it's not just the cost of oil and gas infrastructure or just the cost of renewables in those places. There's a kind of these macro global economic effects in place. And I saw some news today that, there's a large solar project that is breaking ground in Afghanistan, and they advertise a 7 point something cent per kilowatt hour contract as kind of the impetus to do that. I mean, at 7 cents a kilowatt hour in a very challenged place like Afghanistan, that's an extremely low cost of capital using a resource that falls on their ground every day. And so that changes the dynamic, dramatically if you're looking to burn diesel, even in a place as conflicted as Afghanistan. And so it is a bigger macroeconomic impact.
Yeah, we could probably spend a lot of time going back and forth on our thoughts on government policy and how it pertains to international relations. I will just simply say this: I found it quite interesting. I think it's a few months ago. I saw that. I'm assuming this is true. It was from a reputable site, but the U.S. government had revoked it said if you have a U.S. passport, you couldn't go to North Korea. And I remember reading that going, that's an interesting way to tell me where I can't go, where I can and can't go with my body. I can't go to North Korea because I got a U.S. passport. But but some of these thought processes, if we get into energy, you see some of this kind of, I want to call it archaic thinking, at least, because the economy now is so interconnected. You can talk to people, you can dialogue with people, you can interact with people, you can do business around the world any time of the day now. And so it seems like some of these laws were really kind of built maybe for a time before our time, if you will. And so, as far as the Afghanistan stuff, I think one of the things that we were kind of talking about offline here is, for me, it's always about getting people energy that need it. And so if it's solar in Afghanistan, I think we kind of need to step back and say, I don't know what the percentage of people that have power in Afghanistan is, but it's probably not that great, and it's probably not that reliable, especially some of the rural areas. So if they can get it for that kind of price, then why would I be against that?
Well, yeah, no, for sure. And I think you're also coming back to this decentralization of the grid idea. I mean, that is why the decentralized grid, along with cryptocurrencies and a lot of these ideas of distributing the authority, makes so much sense, because it allows individuals to transact with people that they want to transact with, and it allows kind of that transparency and resiliency of the marketplace, and everyone is effectively able to work with everyone else. And that has not been the centralized mechanisms that we built for everything, banking and energy, I think is just the most recent version of that same set of concepts, but it's certainly not the last. And we're going to see lots more of this decentralized view of the world because it's more efficient and it does take out a lot of those regulatory concerns.
Well, speaking of cryptocurrency, I saw Bitcoin was taking a beating the other day, so I don't know.
That's a great point. These things are very, very volatile. And we've seen the SEC, like we talked about on the last show, is starting to make some concerns about what coin offerings mean. It's not sorted. I believe it is the future, but there is a long path between here and universal adoption.
Oh yeah, and I wasn't saying it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's just funny because Bitcoin is one of those things where anytime it does anything, it gets the news. And so I just saw the other day it was falling pretty hard, and I don't know if it's recovered since then or not. But I saw the other day it was dropping pretty fast, and it had folks all over the marketplace. I kind of chuckled because people were like, "See, the Bitcoin thing's a joke," and I was like, if you invested in Bitcoin, I think like 8 years ago, whatever it was, you bought, and you still had it today. The amount of money you'd have made off that investment was crazy. So I kind of thought it was a little bit overhyped there. People kind of piling on Bitcoin, but it is funny because every time you turn on the news, if something happens with Bitcoin, because the market is trying to fill it out and government's trying to fill it out, and so it's interesting. But it does open up doors. And to your point about it, it seems like there is talks now of more and more cryptocurrencies that might be coming on the market.
Absolutely. Yeah, in a lot of different areas, and I think energy will be a really important one because it fits so well with the way in which we're moving to these more distributed resource markets.
Well, absolutely. Well, look, I've enjoyed it as always. Let the listeners know where they can find you, and we can link to that in the show notes. Excellent.
Yeah, you can find me on dissigno.com or the work I do with the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Lab at UC Berkeley.
Great. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.